study was that legislative and public finance management reforms are critical in the fight against corruption. Establishing anti-corruption agencies or reconfiguring the existing agents is a crucial factor in addressing this pandemic. Reforms in the public procurement system and accountability mechanisms are vital to combat procurement-related corruption, which has become endemic in the country. Also, what we found is that there is no single specialized oversight body that has been given the specific mandate to handle and monitor procurement processes in government, while other countries have done so in repelling corruption. In terms of institutional analysis, we found that there are overlaps in the mandates of the anti-corruption institutions meant to combat corruption due to lack of coordination. Also, on budget analysis, we found that budget allocation of these institutions vary and are within budget votes of various government departments, with a significant part of the budget consumed by the compensation of employees. Also, the culture of non-consequence management created by political and administrative leadership to non-compliance measures resulted in an environment that is vulnerable to misappropriation, fraud, and corruption, wastage, and abuse of funds. Also, the political will, ethics, and integrity institutionalization in government and society becomes a critical lever in the fight against corruption. Empirical evidence also shows that the bottom-up measures, which is civil society activism in tackling corruption, is essential, while while the top-down approach, which is the political will, is also a critical measure. So they need to balance. Next slide. In terms of the recommendation, the FFC is of the view that the prerequisite for any measure to fight corruption and move towards support for anti-corruption reforms is consistent political will for good governance and accountability, whereby political leadership and the commitment to fight corruption should come from the highest office and the top levels of a country's political system, with the following understanding of accountability, whereby accountability should identify who needs to be accountable to whom and for what. For instance, accountability of political leaders and public officials to organizational effectiveness and efficiency through compliance measures, rules, and ethic codes, and oversight bodies taking their legislative responsibilities seriously and committing to repelling corruption by taking swift action and imposing sanctions when there is a need. The presidency, in line with political commitment at the top, needs to renew the governance structure of the anti-corruption agencies through the anti-corruption strategy that we have, on the need for reconfiguration and coordination among the existing institutional arrangements to repel duplication of these anti-corruption institutions to get effectiveness and optimum results, including a reconfigured or a dedicated funding framework for these anti-corruption institutions. We are of the view that this is a sign of commitment towards the support on these anti-corruption agencies. Next slide. The presidency as well should consider establishing a public procurement authority that is mandated to show greater transparency and standardization of government contracts, to organize and manage the public procurement processes, and implement a general public procurement policy on behalf of government, guided by the principles of the Constitution with transparency, fairness, and equity. Also, a dedicated or joint civil society organization should be established that educates and empowers society about the dangers and adverse effects of corruption and advocates for anti-corruption reforms as a bottom-up approach in support of the political will. Next slide, please. This chapter is on youth unemployment and the intergovernmental fiscal relations using the case study of South Africa. We know that government over the years have committed significant resources in terms of policies, legislation, and programs to address the unemployment crisis, especially for the youth. South Africa has also set up publicly funded institutions to to address employment, focusing on youth, where we talk about the National Youth Development Agency as well as the SETA, and more recently the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. These interventions, we know that they are funded through the intergovernmental system. Therefore, the overall aim of the chapter is to understand the effectiveness of the fiscal framework and the relevant public institution in addressing these youth unemployment challenges. Next slide. Thank you. Some of the findings of the study shows that government spending and increases in taxes have not resulted in a reduction in unemployment. That is, increase in government spending have been associated with increases in the unemployment rate. Also, the empirical evidence shows that government investment has increased employment. Therefore, government investment and not consumption expenditure reduces unemployment. Also, some of the labor market intervention that are in place, like the Job Fund as well as the EPWP, have resulted in some economic opportunities at macro level for the youth, but they have no significant impact on reducing the high unemployment rate. Next slide. In terms of the recommendations in this chapter, the FOC is of the view that the proportion of gross fixed capital expenditure in the composition of the budget should be systematically increased, consumption expenditure should be reduced, and there is a need to remove structural and institutional rigidities that impact on private investment in order to reduce unemployment. To better target and increase the impact of the incentive, the Commission recommends revising the employee eligibility age from 18 to 29 years old. The age group 24 to 34 years have a relatively high rate of individual not in education, employment and training compared to 15 to 24 years old. National Treasury can also consider deepening the ETI to encourage hiring young women whose not in employment or training rate is relatively higher than of their counterparts for both youth categories. The Department of Employment and Labor, Higher Education, Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability should coordinate all labor market and skills program. More specifically, the Department of Youth, Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability, as it has a mandate of enabling the empowerment and socio-economic upliftment of youth and women. Well-coordinated labor market intervention could bolster the impact of existing labor market programs through more significant integration and leveraging of initiatives. I think this is my last slide. I will hand over to my colleague Nokolo to take you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomonde. Good afternoon, Chairperson and honourable members. I'll be taking you through part 2 of the submission, which includes chapters 3 to 70.7%. Increasing debt service costs continue to crowd out expenditure on basic services. Although South Africa's debt levels are below those of several advanced economies, our interest rates are considerably higher. So this chapter assesses debt and its sustainability. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings from this chapter, firstly, we note that a sustainable debt path is where the fiscus is committed to stabilizing debt by mitigating debt service costs, adjusting the primary balance and seeking improved growth while protecting the needs of the population. So the figure presented shows the interest growth differential, which is a frequently compares the growth rate to the interest rate on debt. As shown in the figure, since 2014, the real interest rate has been persistently higher than the growth rate, which doesn't favor debt sustainability, as higher interest rates are associated with a higher cost of debt, and lower growth would be associated with a higher debt to GDP ratio. So overall, debt sustainability appears to be weak due to sharp increases in the debt stock and debt debt service costs, indications of unproductive debt, and vulnerabilities to macroeconomic shocks, which indicate unfavorable conditions. Another finding from this chapter is that high debt levels are associated with deteriorating growth. Next slide, please. 4 recommendations are made in this chapter. Firstly, the Fiscus, through the Minister of Finance, should strive to rein in rising debt service costs, which make up a substantial portion of fiscal discipline via active debt management and regular reporting regarding debt accumulation, costs, and sustainability. Another recommendation is weak productivity and expenditure should be addressed to create job-enhancing, income-generating growth through quality expenditure and investment enticing reforms. And lastly, investor confidence must be boosted by signaling that public debt is sustainable in the long run to reduce sovereign risk ratings, the cost of debt, and to ensure the continuation of economic support. Next slide, please. Chapter 4 covers affluence and inequality in South Africa's labour market. Income inequality in South Africa has remained high and persistent, and this undermines the inclusive economic growth. Although government grants have played an important role in reducing poverty, slow economic growth as well as suppressed and unequal growth in wages has limited the extent to which cash transfers can reduce income inequality. We note that a key driver of overall inequality in South Africa is earnings inequality from the labour market. So this chapter investigates earnings inequality and earnings trends across different income groups to emphasize the extent of inequality and to identify key shortfalls in the current policy environment. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings from this chapter, firstly, income inequality in South Africa continues to be amongst the highest in the world, and this is for both advanced and emerging countries. In 2017, the top 10% of earners received close to half of total a share of 11%. Between 1995 and 2017, wage growth across the entire earnings distribution appeared to be slow, with the exception of the top 1% who have seen substantial income gains. Another finding from this chapter is that the poorest half of the population's share of total income has gradually decreased, while the top 10% and top 1%'s income share has increased. And it was also found that the economy is dominated by the services industry across all earnings groupings. Finance dominates amongst the most affluent. Trade, domestic services, and agriculture are more prominent amongst the bottom 50% of the population, while the number of people employed in manufacturing appears to have decreased. Next slide, please. This chapter has 2 recommendations. Firstly, the Commission recommends that policies aimed at reducing market, and this requires policies that enable large-scale job creation and more equitable wage growth across different sectors of the economy. This may require greater investment into labor-intensive industries that are able to absorb low-skilled workers into the labor market. The second recommendation is that Stats SA should increase its efforts to enhance the transparency of data and harmonization of data sets to allow for more comparable, accessible, and reliable income statistics. Next slide, please. Chapter 5 covers the effects of social grants and household behavior and expenditure patterns. South Africa's social grant system is widely successful due to its ability to reduce poverty. A point made in this chapter is that the effectiveness of grant systems is generally considered on poverty and inequality reduction, but rarely on applied methods such as consumption. So while measuring the effect on the fiscus by observing changes in household consumption behavior and expenditure patterns. And to add context, over 30% of South Africans receive a monthly social grant, and the demand for social grants is rising due to the country's struggling economic conditions. Next slide, please. Regarding the findings from this chapter, a case study on the social grant network was done, which revealed that the social grant system is efficient in reducing poverty and inequality. It was also found that while the grant network serves millions of South Africans and achieves policy intentions, it's not readily evaluated by the Department of Social Development. Another finding relates to the financial and fiscal impacts on the national budget. Although the grant system is experiencing immense expansion, the limited in optimal welfare outcomes. And regarding consumption trends of grant recipients, the research findings suggest that recipient household consumption increases positively with grant receipts, particularly for food and healthcare items. Next slide, please. 4 recommendations are made in this chapter. Firstly, the amount of the child support grant should be recalculated. Currently, the amount of the grant is not calculated using a specific metric or policy intended amount. The Commission therefore recommends that the calculation method should be reconsidered to accommodate the basic needs of children. The second recommendation is that government should partner with the private sector to support child support policy intentions. It's also recommended that social grants should be integrated into existing social development programs. For example, and lastly, an in-depth investigation into the current social grant network is recommended to inform the current discourse on social development. Next slide, please. Chapter 6 investigates wage trends by assessing the public sector wage bill. Over the last 2 decades, public sector wages and employment levels have grown rapidly. Estimates show that by 2020, public sector employment accounted for about 20% of total employment. And furthermore, since 2004, the wage bill has grown at almost double the inflation rate. When comparing the public and private sectors, the average public sector worker receives a wage premium of over 20%. The increases in both wages and employment have generated an aggregate public sector wage bill that makes up a large share of the budget. So this chapter analyzes the public sector wage trend relative to the private sector to determine its trajectory as well as its sustainability. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings, the chart presented illustrates public sector compensation as a percentage of GDP. It shows that the public sector wage bill has grown at an average rate of 10.5% per year. In 1993, public sector compensation was very high, but it dropped sharply in the mid-1990s, reaching a level of about 10% of GDP during the early to mid-2000s. In 2008, the wage bill increased considerably, which may have been due to an administrative change in pay schedules that resulted in large wage increases for specific public sector employees. And by 2020, public sector compensation rose to a level only previously seen in 1993. Next slide, please. Thank you. These plots show the wage distributions of the private and public sectors. In all 3 periods, the distribution of public sector wages is to the right of the private sector, which confirms that wages are higher in the public sector than they are in the private sector. Another finding is that the gap between higher and lower earners in the public sector appears to have grown. Next slide, please. 3 recommendations are made in this chapter. Firstly, the Department of Public Service and Administration should consider balancing notch progression, cost of living adjustments, and pressures to the fiscus during wage negotiation. We note that the growth of the wage bill has largely been driven by wage increases. Is that National Treasury should commission further research to determine what is driving the decreases in real terms of wages for those at the bottom distribution of wages. And lastly, the Commission recommends that the Department of Public Service and Administration, together with the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, should develop frameworks to guide the public sector on the inclusion of youth in public service. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to my colleague, Shafika.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shafika, and I'll take you through the section 3 of the report. This will be chapter 7 to 11. So chapter 7 looks at the review of the provincial equitable share formula, the responsiveness to the changing social structure. This chapter assesses how provinces allocate their funding received via the PACE formula. We note that the PACE allocation is unconditional, however, it is formula driven, with education and health components being the largest contributors to the allocation. As such, the focus of this chapter was specifically on whether the provincial allocations deviated much from the weightings of the PACE formula, how provinces adjusted when faced with financial pressures, and does the PACE consider the changing social structure. The review focused on analyzing the expenditure trends of these two sectors in all provinces, and it also assessed the social structure changes in provinces for education and how the PACE and other fiscal instruments has responded to these changes. The findings of the report is the result showed an inconsistency between the percentages each province is allocated to education and health. This may be as a result of a lack of costing needs or system to guide the smooth allocation of resources. The study also showed that a significant portion of funds was spent on COE, this being largely due to the PACE formula not taking into consideration the bargaining process and the prevalence of a teacher skills gap. To compensate for growing pressures in COE, provinces has had to cut cost on goods as well as the funding of other departments. There are 3 recommendations that the Commission has proposed based on this chapter. The first recommendation is a costed norms approach, where a full costing exercise should be undertaken by all provinces, particularly for the provision of education and health. The costing results will be used to determine the allocation. Recommendations that allocation by provinces that the Commission has areas. This proposed will also based on this chapter, the first fully informed resource allocation. Secondly, there should be an improved coordination of infrastructure delivery plans and programs to ensure alignment between the PACE and the conditional grant allocations between the National Department of Basic Education and all provincial departments of education. The third recommendation by the Commission is that the Department of Basic Education undertakes a skills audit to identify the skills gap with respect to the old and new curriculum, and based on the audit results, identify the number of teachers who needs to be trained and the funding requirements, as well as developing and implementing a training plan, a training program. Chapter 8 looks at repurposing and realigning the system of provincial conditional grants. Conditional grants are used to drive specific national priorities. This chapter looked at the evolution of grants system over to provinces over a 25-year period, focusing on 4 aspects, which is namely the number and quantum of funding, if there were any changes made to the grant system over the review period, alignment between grant design and policy objectives, and the fairness of the allocation criteria. Total grants. Okay, the findings were as follows. Total grants to provincial sphere has increased from 11% in 1998 to 20% in the 2021 financial year. However, when compared to PACE, conditional grants has experienced inconsistent growth. patterns and has generally lagged in growth. The study also found that education infrastructure grant, HIV/AIDS, and the Human Settlements Development Grant had a number of design flaws. The analysis showed that there was no relationship between the need indicators used in the allocation criteria and the objectives of the education infrastructure grant and HIV/AIDS. Another finding was that the longer that grants remained in existence, the more deviations there were between the output and the original objectives of the grant. The Commission proposed 4 recommendations based on the findings. The first recommendation was to revise the DORA system of grant scheduling, as it created no fiscal incentive to provinces to reveal their expenditure preferences to or sustain expenditure previously funded by conditional grants, updating the allocation formula for education infrastructure grant to ensure alignment of grant need indicators with grant objectives, and further streamlining expected and reported grant outputs. Number 3 was to terminate all HIV/AIDS grant subcomponents unrelated to the grant objective and incorporating them into the provincial equitable share. And then for improved transparency, the grant allocation formula to be published with the grant frameworks. Chapter 9 looks at budget performance and the constitutional right to basic education. The Constitution entitles everyone to basic education as a fundamental human right. As a country, a significant proportion of budget is set aside for basic education. However, recently, spending on basic education has been impacted by the need to reprioritize and cut spending across government. As a result, funding sources such as the PES and related conditional grants have been reduced and will remain relatively stagnant in the foreseeable future. This has raised the concern that the fulfillment of basic rights will be compromised due to the declining allocation. Therefore, the focus of this chapter was to assess the efficiency of the current education spending and to reflect on how spending on basic education can be reprioritized, ensuring that the most essential elements related to basic education are protected. The findings from the report, the analysis showed room to improve spending efficiencies in education. A proper costing framework exercise needs to be undertaken to determine the adequacy of basic education spending and to appropriately quantify the impact of budget cuts on delivery of basic education. Existing evidence also suggests that if expenditure cuts were to be implemented, they should be apportioned in a way that reduces existing inequalities in the system. In addition, to further aid the use of efficiency analysis and understanding of the links between government spending and school performance, it requires the availability and access to information that is credible, reliable, consistently collected, and easily comparable. This chapter, the Commission has set forth 4 recommendations. The first is to reiterate its previous recommendation presented in Chapter 7 regarding the proper costing of delivery of education services be undertaken. Secondly, that government needs to protect the redistributive nature of basic education, its funding system. The Commission also wanted to acknowledge the government's work to implement school-level data collection. However, the Commission recommends that the Department of Basic Education leverages the collection of this data and other sources of school-level data to compile a consolidated basic education sector database that integrates both financial and non-financial information. And then lastly, the recommendation is that the Minister of Basic Education should use the matrix as the foundation of a framework to consult broadly with stakeholders to agree on a guide for spending priorities that should be underpinned by a socio-economic rights approach. Chapter Chapter 10 looks at the independent fiscal institutes and the effectiveness. The analysis assesses the effectiveness of independent fiscal institutes and their influence on fiscal outcomes using a cross-country evidence from 7 international case studies. This was done by looking at several international institutions as part of the case study, and the fiscal and the Financial and Fiscal Commission and the South African Public Parliamentary Budget Office as the South African case study to compare the experience. The aim was to extract the policy lessons for South Africa. The findings of the review looked at several aspects, namely these institutions' mandate, functions, the independence, composition, and their compliance and impact. For example, the outcome for mandates and functions showed that approximately 75% of the IFS assessed macroeconomic and budgetary forecasts, and they all published reports on their finding. With regards to independence, all these institutions had significant independence from both a legal and operational standpoint. Based on the findings, the Commission has made several recommendations. The Parliamentary Budget Office and the Commission should endorse government's macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts. They should also cost all government policies and should monitor compliance with the fiscal rules and objectives. Government should establish a process of periodically reviewing the operational independence of the South African Parliamentary Budget Office and the Commission by instituting a set of minimum standards. The Commission and the South African Parliamentary Budget Office should be provided with timely and comprehensive access to all relevant information, and the legal basis for the compliance and explanation of deviance from the recommendation principle for the Commission should be strengthened as well. And finally, the Commission and the South African Parliamentary Budget Office should formally be consulted on the budget formulation and execution. The last chapter looks at district municipalities, powers, functions, and the funding framework. This chapter reviewed the functions and powers of district municipalities. The district development model introduced in 2019 requires district municipalities to play a central role. The model is a joint planning process spanning across all 3 spheres of government to provide a single strategically focused plan for each of the 44 districts and the 8 metropolitans. However, this model is established against the backdrop of district municipalities that are dysfunctional and in financial distress, and local government sector that is deteriorating. The question is whether district municipalities are well positioned and capacitated to play the leading role envisaged by the DDM. The review needed to undertake a comprehensive analysis of the functions and powers of the district municipalities and their funding framework, with a view of making recommendations of how districts could be repositioned to play the envisaged role. The findings from the report. As we are all aware, there are 2 types of district municipalities. C1 districts are classified as those without powers, and C2 are districts with powers, as they provide bulk water supply services. Local government is autonomous, and the bulk of their revenue is generated through their own rates and taxes. However, this is not the case for district municipalities, especially C1 municipalities, which are heavily dependent on transfers. Government transfers to district municipalities consist of the RSC replacement grant and the local government equitable share. However, C1 municipalities do not receive any funding from the basic component, as well as conditional grants related to basic infrastructure. These municipalities are heavily dependent on the RSC replacement grant to fund their budget. However, REC replacement grant allocation has received several criticisms, mainly due to the fact that allocations are based on the historical revenue-raising capacity of district municipalities. These two figures shows the allocations for both the local government equitable share as well as the REC replacement grant for the 44 districts. From the diagram, we can see that there is a huge variation in the size of the allocation. Example, the highest allocation in the 2021-22 financial year was 438.2 million rand compared to the lowest of 14.9 million rand. These variations are not linked to population, number of indigent, etc. This figure shows the correlation between the proportion of functions provided by districts and the REC replacement grant. It showed that the link between the two variables is weak and even slightly negative, meaning that to a certain extent, district municipalities with fewer functions are allocated disproportionately larger REC levy replacement grants compared to districts with more functions. Findings from the interview, the analysis showed that district municipalities faced many challenges that would make it difficult for them to fulfill the envisaged role. The challenges related